Hello, and welcome back to the Rhetoric Prof stream. Today we've got a juicy one for you. Fallacies, fallacy theory that is a reading in my class. Argumentation, we're studying heuristic, the classical theory of tricky arguments or fallacious arguments. And what exactly that means is partly what this book, or this chapter of this book that we're going to read, is about. Because if you try to figure out what a trick is, you try to say, oh, this is what makes something kind of an error or something false, you run into a lot of problems pretty quickly. Because is it always an error? If there's some kind of like form or structure behind it, you say, okay, this is wrong. Is it always an error? And we'll see pretty quickly that a lot of things that we call fallacies are not like that. They're not deductive fallacies that are a necessary kind of error, because they're not talking about necessary forms of reasoning. On the other hand, do we just want to say, okay, well, anything goes, there's no such thing as a fallacy, all reasoning is equal, and basically undermine reasoning itself as some kind of normative principle that binds us to commitments that we're making in arguments in some kind of way that we shouldn't just be able to wriggle out of. So there's some problem here that's really deep at the heart of argumentation theory, and for a long time I was resistant to even touching on this subject for a few reasons, which I think maybe is worth talking about. One is that when you show a bunch of students fallacies, they get really excited because you have a list of stuff, and I can then take these things and identify them in the world, and then I have a little bit of power. It feels like I have power over other people, because I'd be like, that's an ad hominem argument. That's a moving the goalposts argument. That's a no true Scotsman fallacy. And I'm telling people that they're violating the rules of a game that they themselves may not be totally aware of, but be like, sorry, you're arguing, you're playing, you're doing it wrong. And to me, that's not a very useful form of, by itself, if that's the result. That's not the kind of thing I wish to produce in the world out of my education. But on the other hand, I was kind of worried that people would get confused by the fallacies, which also sometimes happens. They're like, well, this doesn't seem wrong, but it seems to fit the fallacy right. So how do we deal with these problems? So in this version of the class that I teach now, where we have this persona called the heuristic, this has become a new interest for me to thinking about fallacies and this text, Hamblin, which is, I think, probably the major work on fallacies, modern work on fallacies, tries to deal with some of these problems in fallacy theory as it's developed historically and in the present. The book's a little bit old, so it doesn't deal with all of the new things that have come about in fallacy theory since this was written, but I don't think that's really that important for almost anybody unless you are pursuing an academic career in argumentation studies, which I wouldn't recommend. There's not a lot of money in that. So without kind of further ado, I think maybe it's worth just jumping right in, because a lot of this stuff, this background, is exactly what Hamblin will start with here when he talks about the standard treatment. He says, there's hardly a subject that dies harder or has changed so little over the years. After 2 millennia of active study of logic, and in particular, after over half of that most iconoclastic of centuries, the 20th AD. That's a pretty funny thing to specify. I'm talking about the 20th century AD, not the 20th century BC. But this is a long enough span of time that you might wonder. It's not that long, but we still find fallacies classified, presented, and studied in much the same old way. So usually sometimes bad undergraduate papers will begin since the beginning of time. And even here he doesn't say since the beginning of time, but he kind of earns this because he's read so much of this stuff. He's like, and this is bad that it's been going on the same way with almost no change for 2,500 years. Maybe we need a little bit of fresh air in here. So Aristotle's principal list of 13 types of fallacies in his Sophistical Refutations. The Latin title is De Sophisticis Elenchis, from the Greek periton sophistikon elenkon, whence they have been called sophisms, and sometimes elenchs. I've never heard anyone call them elenchs ever, but it's a fun word. I wonder if it's accepted in Scrabble. Still appears, usually with 1 or 2 omissions and a handful of additions, in many modern textbooks of logic. And though there have been many proposals for reform, none has met more than temporary acceptance. Such setbacks as Aristotle's treatments has had have been as much due to irrelevant vicissitudes of history as any kinds of criticisms of its shortcomings. Thus, although the current in the ancient world in Athens, Alexandria, and Rome, it was lost to Western Europe. for some centuries during the monastic period, but was rediscovered with enthusiasm about the 12th century when it began to form a section of the logic curriculum in its emerging universities. And this is, probably more historical background than you need, but the 11th and the 12th centuries were really important in Europe for the rediscovery. Even though we think of those as medieval and not the Renaissance, they're really important. There's something called the Latin translation movement, or what scholars call the Latin translation movement, where a lot of works that were by important Greek thinkers were kind of being rediscovered in Arabic translations and made into Greek translations, and then from Greek into Latin. So there was kind of a movement of these texts that existed but weren't in languages that people in Western Europe could read. So this movement of kind of translating them new was really important for the development of all sorts of things that are kind of surprising, like the university itself, for instance. But anyway, since that time until the present century, textbooks of logic not containing a short chapter on fallacies have been the exception. And since for most of the period all students took logic, Europe's men of affairs had generally regarded a nodding acquaintance. Ah, yes, I like this term. Yes, I'm sure I've heard of that somewhere. Yes, this is kind of the result of a lot of education, is you just get a nodding acquaintance with thing. Is that good or bad? I'm not sure. Maybe it's better to just be completely ignorant, because then you're still a little bit curious about something. I don't know. With the standard version of Aristotle's doctrine as a routine necessity of the same character as knowledge of the multiplication table. Quite a few of these men, in fact, have written accounts of fallacies themselves. They include at least one pope, 2 saints, archbishops in profusion, the first chancellor of the University of Oxford, and a Lord Chancellor of England. Well, let me try zooming in here a little bit. Hopefully that doesn't make... Oh, that was too much. Yeah, I'm using Adobe today, which is not my usual choice, but I thought I might give it a shot. The tradition has repeatedly proved too strong for its dissentients. Ramus, in the 16th century, this guy is Peter Ramus or Petrus Ramus, was important for what he's about to describe, led an attack on Aristotle and refused to consider fallacies as a proper subject for logic on the grounds that the study of correct reasoning was enough in itself to make their nature clear. So he was like, why are you studying errors? Just get good. Just reason right. And if you're not doing that, then clearly it's bad. Ramus was, well, first of all, he's murdered in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, which is a kind of weird little anecdote of history. But also, he kind of had the reputation at the time of being he was very popular, but he was kind of very popular because he maybe simplified things, and maybe simplified them so much that he kind of made them stupider. And it's hard to be very sympathetic with the old logic chopping Latinists in the world, but they might, maybe some of them were kind of right that maybe Ramus was not that smart of a guy, but he was very powerful, kind of very effective propagandist for his educational reforms. But anyway, old debates. But within a few years, his own followers had reinstated the subject, and one of them, Heitzobücher, maybe, actually published a treatise entitled The Theory of the Solution of Fallacies, deduced and explained from the logic of Petrus Ramus. Bacon and Locke also dropped the Aristotelian treatment, but only to replace it with treatments of their own, which in due course became partially fused with it again. Everyone's trying to be like, no, we can do it better than Aristotle, and then as they start doing it, they're like, we kind of reinvented Aristotle. Damn. During the past century, some of the more mathematically minded of logicians, starting with Boole, and if you've heard of Boolean logic, this is a major advance in logic. Sometimes people say it's the first advance in logic since Aristotle. That's not right, but there's a reason why people might say that. Have dropped the subject from their books in apparent agreement with Ramus, but it is possible to discern a trend back. What about other traditions than our own? Constantinople, in the interval between the decline of Rome and its own fall to the Turks, continued the Greek tradition that was in decline further west. And some Arab logicians also inherited Aristotle's Sophistical Refutations. So the Sophistical Refutations is the book on fallacies. That's the major Aristotelian text on fallacies, and wrote their own commentaries on it. But these traditions were mere outposts of our own. Further east, we find an apparently independent logical tradition in India, which, starting with the Nyaya Sutra, has its own doctrine of fallacies as an adjunct to its own theory of inference. Indian logicians have displayed the same concern to explore the forms of faulty reasoning, and the same inability either to move outside their original tradition or to dispense with it. The study of the Indian tradition is of special interest here in providing us with a control on which to test our woolier historical generalizations. So, the Indian logical tradition. I guess what he's kind of saying here is that there is a certain kind of traditionalism in both the Greek and the Indian logical traditions, and they're distinct in that we can kind of see what is contingent about both traditions by comparing them to one another. And maybe that will help us kind of advance things. And people have been doing that work for quite some time. For me, my favorite kind of reference text for this stuff, which is probably very old and outdated, and I'm sure specialists on this subject would laugh, but to me feels like a really good comprehensive thing if you're interested in this, is actually a text called Buddhist Logic, which is in 2 volumes by, I think he was a Soviet researcher. And the Nyaya logicians, a lot of the opponents of the Buddhists are also kind of included there. And he also makes comparisons to Western philosophical logic. So I'm not going to say that it's an easy text to kind of get into, but if you're interested in this subject, that would be where I would go, Buddhist Logic. The name of the guy is very difficult to pronounce, so I'm not going to try to pronounce it. But if you look that up, you'll probably find the right text. Strangely, in a certain sense, there has never yet been a book on fallacies. Never, that is, a book-length study of the subject as a whole, or of incorrect reasoning in its own right, rather than as an afterthought or adjunct to something else. Schopenhauer's Art of Controversy is too short. Not for me. This is the other text you're reading if you're in my class. But this, I think, is almost kind of a parody text. It's like 37 points. He's like, here are the ways that you can win arguments, basically through dirty tricks. And I don't think that Schopenhauer, even though he's a weird guy, I don't think he's actually saying that this is what you ought to do. He's just like, this is what people do. This is how people do it. It's kind of a satirical or parodic text. And Bentham's book of Fallacies, too specialized to qualify. A book entitled Fallacies, A View of Logic from the Practical Side by Alfred Sidgwick belies its title and is in large part concerned with a particular theory of non-fallacious logical reasoning. The medieval treatises, though some of them run to enormous length. Can we see that? Yeah. That of St. Albert the Great, for example, has 90,000 Latin words. That would be a great kind of advertisement, like a splash star on the front of a box. Be like, now with 90,000 Latin words. Be like, woohoo. No, that's not an exciting amount of anything, but certainly not of Latin words, God. And mere commentaries on Aristotle, even one, as in the case of Peter of Spain's treatise on the major fallacies. So Peter of Spain is this medieval writer who's extremely important to Western European development of logic, to the chagrin of many people who will come after him, be like, oh my God, all these people do nothing. People go to university, they don't do anything these days but go on TikTok. No, I mean, they don't do anything these days but just read Peter of Spain. They think they could just read Peter of Spain and that they've solved all the world's problems. Nonsense. So in some sense, you could say the tradition of humanism in the universities, the university humanists, not all of them were in universities, but the ones that were, like Peter of Spain was their main guy they were attacking. They're like, we got to move beyond this guy. Juan Luis Vives, he's like, oh my God, what a donkey's ass. Not just an ass, a donkey's ass. They do not indicate the fact in their titles. And all the others, including the wordy treatment by J.S. Mill, he's a 19th century guy. So we're jumping all over time here. Must be counted as short treatments and longer works. Mill is just as wordy in the rest of his volume. Even Aristotle's Sophistical Refutations is probably only the 9th book of his Topics. So Topics is another text by Aristotle on dialectical argumentation. And I don't know if he's saying this as a serious argument, but there really is some kind of question, and I don't know all of the arguments, that are current or modern about the collection of Aristotle's works. Like, are they all separate works or books? And they were kind of put together later on by this guy whose name I don't remember. So sometimes people really want to interpret things as being like, well, this all makes sense together as a work, but that in this case may not have been the organizational strategy of Aristotle himself. So other people made interpretations and split these things up. It's very possible that you can read Sophistical Refutations as just a 9th book of a larger, we use book in English for both of these terms, a 9th section of the book Topics, which would just be like, oh, also, and if these things come up in your disputations with the sophists, here are some ways to get out of it, just some kind of afterthoughts. And so he's like, so the major text itself might just be kind of an afterthought for this topic. So anyway, this is all an argument to say, like, look, we don't have a lot of stuff on this. There are, of course, works on fallacy of a slightly different kind, namely less formal works such as Fallis' Straight and Crooked Thinking, Stebbing's Thinking to Some Purpose, and perhaps Camiot's Critique of Poor Reason, and Stuart Chase's Tyranny of Words and Guides to Straight Thinking. Starting to see a theme here. We got to straighten out these thoughts. These thoughts are too crooked, which aim to induce in the reader an appreciation of and feeling for faulty reasoning by giving discussions based mainly on examples. Some of these books, I'm not going to say which, are good, but they do not supply the need for a critical theoretical survey. Into the same category, or perhaps into the same space between the two stools. Stools? I consign a book entitled Fallacy, The Counterfeit of Argument. So some of this stuff is kind of old school. I think we can move past it pretty quickly. The truth is that nobody these days is particularly satisfied with this corner of logic. The traditional treatment is too unsystematic for modern tastes. Yet to dispense with it, as some writers do, is to leave a gap that no one knows how to fill. We have no theory of fallacy at all, and in the sense in which we have theories of correct reasoning or inference. Yet we feel the need to ticket and tabulate certain kinds of fallacious inference process, which introduce considerations falling outside the other topics in our logic books. In some respects, as I shall argue later, we are in the position of the medieval logicians before the 12th century. We have lost the doctrine of fallacy and need to rediscover it. But it is all more complicated than that, because these days we set ourselves higher standards of theoretical rigor and will not be satisfied for long with theory less ramified and systematic than we are used to in other departments of logic. It's funny because Peter Ramus, his name is kind of associated with this. It also means branch in Latin. Ramus, ramified, something being ramified, it has all these branches. But that's also what his system was about, creating little branches off of words. It's kind of weird. I don't know which came first, but probably the branch thing. And one of the things we may find is that the kind of theory we need cannot be constructed in isolation from them. What I shall suggest is that interest in fallacies has always been, in part, misplaced, and that the function of their study has been to remind the student, and his teacher, of features of the scope and limitations of the other parts of logic. What the logicians of the 13th and 14th century made of the study of fallacies is especially interesting in this connection. So we study fallacies in some sense to see why logic might fail. When human senses fail, when human logic fails, where do we turn? Do you turn to the succor of an all-knowing God who will, in the next life, clarify what the correct argument was? Like, well, what about for right now? What if we want to deal with the problems of logic that we have right now? Where will we turn? Some people don't acknowledge this. They're like, there are no problems with logic. These are people who have never studied logic. You encounter problems in logic relatively early on. I mean, everybody knows the liar's paradox, right? This is one of the more famous logical paradoxes that you might encounter just popularly, where someone says, I am lying. Now, actually in practical life, we have all sorts of ways of resolving this. It's not that big of a deal if someone says, I am lying. You're like, oh, about what? But if we took a logical interpretation of that sentence and tried to reconstruct it, it produces all of these problems for logic that logic maybe has been able to resolve, but it's not even that clear whether it has. So, and you might say, well, that's very boring. You might also not be that interested in logic, because those are the kinds of problems that or were being explored through fallacies. And so people weren't necessarily studying fallacies always because maybe originally there were people who were like trying to do tricky things. But then the study of fallacies came because we're like, well, what if we set up our own tricks and we can kind of see what the limitations are of the rules of logic that we've created? Sometimes these rules don't work and we want to figure out why they don't work. And so that was a lot of the medieval practice of logic was around these ideas of sophismata, or what he's calling sophisms. That's what it was about. So they created their own fallacies in order to test or probe the limits of logic. That is, however, for later chapters. To start with, let us set the stage for an account, not of what went on in the 13th century or even of what Aristotle wrote, but of the typical or average account, as it appears in the typical short chapter or appendix of the average modern textbook. And what we find in most cases, I think it should be admitted, is as debased, worn out, and dogmatic a treatment as could be imagined. Incredibly tradition-bound, yet lacking in logic and in historical sense alike, and almost without connection to anything else in modern logic at all. That's pretty brutal, right? And he's like, and that's what I'm about to do. This is the part of the book in which a writer throws away logic and keeps his reader's attention, if at all, only by retailing the traditional puns, anecdotes, and witless examples of his forebears. Everything that runs has feet. The river runs, therefore the river has feet. This is a medieval example, but the modern ones are no better. As a whole, the field has a certain fascination for the connoisseur, but that is the best that can be said for it. A fallacious argument, as almost every account from Aristotle onward tells you, is one that seems to be valid, but it is not so. Two different ways of classifying fallacies immediately present themselves. First, taking for granted that we have arguments that seem to be valid, we can classify them according to what it is that makes them not so. Or secondly, taking for granted that they are not valid, we can classify them according to what it is that makes them seem to be valid. Most accounts take neither of these easy courses. Aristotle's original classification tries to be both sorts at once, and there are writers even in modern times who adopt it without criticism. Of those who invent their own classical classifications, many share this uncertainty of purpose. And in any case, their most noteworthy characteristic is that they disagree not only with the Aristotelians, but also extensively with one another, and have quite failed to establish any account for longer than the time it takes for a book to go out of print. This is such a funny kind of like brutal opening. And it's unfortunately the chapter that I have assigned to my class, because he's like, look, I have to kind of go through all this stuff, this like half-assed bull crap, nonsense treatments of fallacies before I can get into a more serious one. But because this is an introductory class, we have to start with the nonsense average account of the fallacies. But at least here, he's aware of it. He's not presenting this kind of average account as being amazing. They're problematic in a lot of different ways. So, but he nevertheless thinks it's important to kind of set it forward so we know where we're beginning. In fact, though everyone has this classification, it is commonly argued that it is impossible to classify fallacies at all. De Morgan writes, there is no such thing as a classification of the ways in which men arrive at an error. It is as much to be doubted whether there ever can be. And Joseph says, that's someone's last name, but it just sounds like any Joey says, truth may have its norms, but error is infinite in its aberrations, and they cannot be digested in any classification. So, it might take, there's only one truth, but there's, a million different lies or errors, ways to go wrong. That's this position. But even they frequently express doubts. Cohen and Nagel say, it would be impossible to enumerate all the abuses of logical principles occurring in the diverse matters in which men are interested. They go on to consider certain outstanding abuses. He's like, so they say we can't do it, and then they go do it. But they're like, oh, these ones are special. Despite divergences of arrangement, there is considerable overlap in raw materials between one writer and another. The individual kinds of fallacy are much the same, even down to their names. It will suit us, therefore, to forget about arrangement and describe the raw material. I shall start by running through the traditional list and then discuss some additions. I'm mainly concerned with recent accounts, but draw here from the older ones. So the rest of the chapter, he's going to go through these traditional classifications. So you've got your caveat lector. You've gotten your kind of warning as a reader. Listen, don't take this stuff too seriously. There are better ways to understand this than what we have. This is something to give you some hooks to hang it on. And also, these will overlap each other. This is not a kind of systematic form of classification where everything is going to fall into a special neat box. Your peas and your mash will touch each other here. So if you get into a kind of long, convoluted conversation, be like, is this equivocation or is this ad hominem? Or it might just be better to say, let's go do something else. Because there's probably no way to resolve these questions. They're just perspectives that allow you to see arguments in a certain light. But I think that it is useful. I've kind of come around on this. I think it is useful to have these terms so we can see things in this way. The first classification is equivocation. And this is, I think, actually one of the more amusing forms of fallacy. And comes up a fair bit. Aristotle classified fallacies into those dependent on language and those outside language. The traditional Latin terms are indictione and extradictionem, from the Greek paraten lexin and exotes lexios. So, beyond, what does he say, outside language? Outside language is probably not a bad way to understand this, but it's something in being like saying, is the flaw in reasoning in the words themselves or in the matter of the thing that we're talking about? So we have another traditional Latin distinction is between verba and res, between words and things. But our sense of things, especially in English, just does not capture what they meant. So res has this sense of like the matter of discourse, the thing that we're talking about. We might talk about it in different words. Sometimes it's in the words themselves. Sometimes it's in the way we're reasoning about the thing that we're talking about. So these are the ones that are from the words. Fallacies is the first category of those that rise from ambiguity in the words or sentences in which they are expressed. In the simplest case of fallacies dependent on language, the ambiguity can be traced to double meaning in a single word. This is the fallacy of equivocation. The word equivocation refers literally to pairs of words that are the same in pronunciation. Ralph Lever, one of the earliest writers on logic in English, translated equivoca as like-sounding words. And its opposite, univoca, where we get the word univocal from, sort of, as plain-meaning words. The term commonly has a pejorative sense. You can say that it's old-timey because it's not plainly spelled, in that an equivocal argument is one deliberately intended to deceive. Though in spite of a distinction made by Max Black, this is not usually a part of a logician's meaning. And also, I think it's kind of stupid to be like, oh, these ones are the ones that are deliberate. How do you know? I mean, I just don't. I find that to be a very unsatisfactory way, even for the minimal amount that I care about fallacies and their classification, to be like, this one's deliberate, this one's not. I don't really know that you can tell that in some obvious way, so I just think it's better to ignore those as well. I agree with Hamblin. At its lowest level, equivocation is plain punning. At least 3 modern American textbooks I have consulted think it's worthwhile to give the examples. Some dogs have fuzzy ears. My dog has fuzzy ears. Therefore, my dog is some dog. Right? It's kind of a joke, right? You can hear how I say it with my voice. My dog is some dog, right? It's like, well, okay, that sense of some dog, and there's a few kind of ways to interpret this fallacy. Some dogs have fuzzy ears. My dog has fuzzy ears. Like, it could be an equivocation in what we mean by have, but really it's about some dogs. This phrase, some dog, is not an object. It's not an object that can be kind of transferred. It's a category. So, and Esterly is only graver, not more in earnest, in quoting the traditional, whatever is immaterial is unimportant. Whatever is spiritual is immaterial. Therefore, whatever is spiritual is unimportant. So this works on the equivocation of this word that we might need to remind ourselves. It's a slightly older sense of that word. Immaterial has 2 senses. If someone says, well, that's immaterial to the case at hand, I'm saying it's not relevant. But I can also mean immaterial in the literal sense of something being not material. So the spiritual world is not material. That is part of its definition for some people. So therefore, now he's kind of combining both of these senses to say that the spiritual world is unimportant, but it just plays on that double meaning, right? One of Abraham France's example in Elizabethan times was, all the maids in Camberwell may dance in an eggshell. He explains, of a little village by London, I don't know why I'm doing this voice, where Camberwell may be taken for the well in the town, or the town itself. So here, I don't even why Camberwell can mean the town or a well in the town. So all the maids in Camberwell can dance in an eggshell makes sense for the maids that are in the well because there's 0 of them. So 0 maids can dance in an eggshell. And again, so lastly, the mayor of Earth is the best mayor next to the mayor of London. Where the town, God knows, is a poor thing, and the mayor thereof a silly fellow. In respect of the mayors of diverse other cities, yet it is the very next to London, because there is none between. These examples serve to introduce us to different kinds of ambiguity. They do not, however, provide good examples of fallacies, since whatever our feelings about maids in Camberwell, or the mayor of Erith, I don't know if that's supposed to be. I don't know. I don't understand that one, actually. We are hardly capable of being deceived by any serious chain of reasoning, exploiting the double meanings in the statements about them. So here I would say I have a slight disagreement with Hamblin. And it has to do with what's kind of useful in fallacies. So I mentioned this distinction that we can make before between fallacies that arise in everyday life and what the medieval logicians called sophismata, which are intentionally designed fallacies that are created. Well, why are those fallacies created? They're created for someone that's studying reasoning and inference to try to, if you figure out why it doesn't work, you understand something better. And it's not for being deceived. It's not intended that way. And you could say, okay, well, that's not really what a fallacy is. I think it is. I think those are also fallacies. Why not? Why not call them fallacies? But they're just created for a different purpose. They don't arise naturally. So the same way that some elements are created only in a lab, you can only get elements in a lab. They don't appear in nature, but we still consider them elements. I would still consider them fallacies, these kind of stupid ones, because they serve a pedagogical purpose. If we try to find better examples, we meet another kind of difficulty, in that what is non-trivial may be controversial. Joseph attempts to illustrate equivocation with discussion of example as follows. A mistaken point of law, says Blackstone. So Blackstone is a very famous English commenter on the law, which every person of discretion not only may, but is bound and presumed to know, is in criminal cases no sort of defense. So this is just relating what's sometimes goes by the Latin maxim, ignoratio juris non excusa. The ignorance of the law is not an excuse. You can't be like, oh, I didn't know. So the state must perhaps presume a knowledge of the law, and so far we are bound to know it in the sense of being required under penalty. But a criminal action done in ignorance of the law that a man is legally bound to know is often considered morally discreditable, as if the knowledge of the law on the matter were a plain moral duty. How far that is so in a particular case may be a very doubtful question. The maxim quoted tends to confuse the moral with the legal obligation. So saying that something is not an excuse, well, we might say it's not a legal excuse, but it might be a moral excuse. But the fact that we kind of associate these two meanings together in ways that are not trivial, sometimes the moral and the legal seem to belong together, sometimes they don't, means it's hard to say exactly which use of this is an equivocation and which is just ambiguity. All that Joseph claims, however, is that it is doubtful that moral and legal duty must be identified, not that it is clear that they must be distinguished. If moral words were not slippery, there would be little need for the study of moral philosophy. For this to be a clear example of equivocation, there needs to be a clear distinction between moral rectitude and obedience to the law of the land. We know, of course, that there is sometimes a case for saying that the law is wrong and should be altered or even disobeyed. But the law of the land is interpreted by the courts, and the courts are inevitably and properly influenced to some extent by moral factors. And on the other hand, it could be argued that a certain conformity to law, insofar as it promotes the general good through stable government, is morally commendable on its own account. We do not need to resolve these questions here, but it must be clear that there is at least room for debate. In many contexts, the two subsenses of a word, it means like in a dictionary entry, there'd be sense number one and sense number two. They're kind of distinct meanings that might be related, though, can be conflated without risk, so that a charge of equivocation needs to be backed up with a demonstration that the context is one in which the distinction is necessary. That's kind of a long-winded way of saying something I already said, but you could see one of the reasons why studying fallacies is difficult. It's because in any given case, whether something even counts as a fallacy is itself part of an argument about this particular argument and about the nature of fallacies in general. So you kind of get into the weeds pretty quickly with interesting examples, non-ridiculous, made-up examples, ones that are not clearly false. Once they're clearly false, you can say, okay, now we can ask why it's clearly false. But in the natural examples, a lot of time we could say, well, is it? Is that clearly false? Why would we think that? The more satisfactory accounts of equivocation are those which, usually at some length, give us hints in practice in looking for those slight shifts of direction which may lay a detailed argument open to objection. Max Black, for example, discusses 4 types of meaning shift, which he calls sign, referent, dictionary meaning, contextual meaning, connotation, denotation, and process product. So these are kinds of slippages of meaning where someone's pretending that the same thing kind of holds all the way through, but there's a little bit of difference. I wish I had good examples. I can give you a good example of a fake form of equivocation that one of my students came up with. Veneers are false. Veneers are false. Everything that's false doesn't exist. Therefore, veneers don't exist. Okay, that works as a sophismata, or sophism, let's say. That's the plural. Because we know that veneers do exist, in a very practical way. So then we have to figure out where the equivocation comes. Okay, it comes from false. 2 different meanings of the word false. False as appearing, false appearance versus falsehood in some non-existent fictional way. What would be a kind of one where we go from, let's say, dictionary meaning to contextual meaning? You might kind of try to think of ways that this could slide, which someone would say something like, there's certain words where a specific meaning can kind of lead to a one inference, where we'd say, anything that is a crime is illegal. And you're saying that war is a crime, but nothing that's happening here, there's no law against it. And it's like, okay, well, we're using crime in 2 slightly different contexts. Of course, there's international law and war, so, that wasn't the best example. But you could think of a situation in which someone would call something a crime, and you'd be like, well, that's not really illegal, so it's not a crime. You might kind of impose the dictionary definition, or the stricter sense, sensu stricto is sometimes being used in the Latin, versus a kind of more open sense, and that can lead to an equivocation, arguably. Okay, amphiboly. The word amphibole means double arrangement. For many years, it assumed an extra syllable and became amphibology. But this is just bad Greek. Okay. Amphibole is the same kind of thing as equivocation, except that the double meaning occurs in a construction involving several words unambiguous in themselves. Copy cites the wartime austerity slogan, "Save soap and waste paper." That's a fun one. I like that one. Do you see how it works? Save soap and waste paper makes the thing seem like we should waste paper, but waste paper, at least in the UK English, is a way of referring to, let's say, I think what we would call toilet paper in the United States. So these are saying save soap and waste paper, whereas not save soap and waste paper. But we can read it in two different ways. And Thomas Gilby was set on train of amphibolous speculation by the sight in Albemarle Street of a door plate announcing the Society for Visiting Scientists. The I don't why is Society for Visiting. I don't actually see what the amphibole is there. What could it be? Oh, I see. The Society for parentheses visiting scientists, or the Society for Visiting Scientists. Like, we all get together and we go visit the scientists. Which is kind of funny. These are just things that you almost do as a kid, or I used to do these. I'm glad I stopped doing this because it was like driving me crazy for a while. But maybe you had this period when you were a child. Hopefully it stopped, where you like couldn't help but read everything literally, even though you knew it wasn't, and then you'd like create kind of, jokes, like, oh my God, what if that was the case, right? It's a kind of very annoying humor that sometimes children and sometimes adults have, but a lot of that is based on amphibole. The older examples of this fallacy, some of which are still reproduced in textbooks, often involve fables about ambiguous prophecies, decrees, or inscriptions. Amphibole, when the sentence may be turned both the ways, so that a man shall be uncertain what way to take, as that old sophister the devil deluded Pyrrhus by giving him such an intricate answer. Iote Iacida Romanos vincere posse. I now foretell the thing to thee which after shall be known, that though King Pyrrhus once shalt see the Romans overthrow. Where this word overthrow may either be the nominative case and applicable to King Pyrrhus, or the accusative and attributed to the Romans. So, what's being overthrown here? Thou, King Pyrrhus, once shall see the Romans overthrown. So, that's such a hard example to read because the syntax is really from an older version of English. But Pyrrhus ends up being overthrown by the Romans. No more kings. But he interprets it himself as like, I will see them overthrown. I will conquer them. Okay, it's kind of a stupid example. He goes into these really old-timey examples because he's a scholar and he's trying to show you something. But it's hard to understand. The Latin can be translated either I say that you can conquer the Romans, or I say that the Romans can conquer you. Iacida is another name for King Pyrrhus. The example is repeated by Joseph and by Fernside and Holther. Copy and others give the apparently similar example of the Delphic oracle's prophecy to Croesus, that if he went to war with the Persians, he would overthrow a mighty empire, fulfilled in the event by his overthrowing his own. No! Oh my God. I think probably the more famous ones are like, yeah, that's fine. We don't need any more examples. This is not a clear case of amphibole, since it could be argued that Croesus was deceived as much by his own plain inability to see a possible implications. Whatever. As Herodotus reasonably says, after an answer like that, the wise thing would have been to send again to inquire which empire was meant. I just want to have a follow-up. I just want to piggyback on that prophecy. Shipper and Shoe, following De Morgan, take the... I'm sorry, I'm laughing at the sound of their names. That's not very professional. Take the numerical specification x equals 2 times 4 plus 3 to be amphibole, denoting either 11 or 14. Presumably the same applies in the absence of brackets or some special convention to the symbolic formulation 2 times 4 plus 3. Elaborate examples of mispunctuation have also been classified under this heading. Yeah. And here are a bunch. I saw a comet drop down hail. I saw the clouds suck up a whale. I saw the sea within a glass. I saw some cider beat an ass. I saw a man full 2 miles high. I saw a mountain sob and cry. I saw a child with 1,000 eyes. All this was seen without surprise. Okay, this is kind of a riddle, It can be converted into reasonable sense by repunctuation to put the stops after comet, cloud, sea, cider, man, mountain. I saw a comet. Drop down hail, I saw the clouds. Suck up a whale, I saw the sea. Within a glass, I saw some cider. Beaten ass, I saw a man. You know, it's like, I don't know, not very interesting. But a similar case of misplaced punctuation forms the central theme of the early Elizabethan play, Ralph Royster Doyster, in which a public letter writer's punctuation of a dictated love letter turns into a stream of insults. This example is of some importance in literary history in that its citation by the logician Thomas Wilson was the clue that led to the ascription of the play, whose author had been unknown to Nicholas Udall. Okay, that should really be a footnote, bro. But puns and anecdotes do not take the place of logical analysis. How many of the examples given are genuine cases of fallacy? The slogan, save soap and waste paper, is not an argument at all, and even if some kind of invalid argument were erected on it, there's very little likelihood that anyone would be persuaded of its validity. Again, purists may or may not have misconstrued the prophecy made to him if he indulged in any kind of argument. What was mainly wrong with it was that in believing what he thought he was told, he started from a false premise. To get a good example of amphibly as it is defined by the textbooks, we need to find a case in which someone was misled by an ambiguous verbal construction in such a way that taking it to state a truth in one of its sentences, he also came to take it to state a truth in its other sense. None of the examples so far quoted is of this character, and I regret to report that in the books I have consulted, I found no example that is any better. Can we do one on the fly? Probably not. It would be hard to do it. But my guess is where we would find amphibly in this way would be in the law itself, would be in maybe contract law or depositions, where sometimes people will say something in one way that will kind of, a certain interpretation will give them, will be legally sound when they're kind of pressed on its meaning, but it will imply another way of reading it based on the way that they constructed it. But I can't think of any off the top of my head. If you can, leave me a comment when you're watching this on YouTube. Composition and division. The fallacy of composition is described by Max Black as that in which what is true of a part is therefore asserted to be true of the whole. His examples, however, refer not to arguments from a part to the whole, but to arguments from all the parts to the whole. Thus, everybody in this city pays his debts. Therefore, you can be sure that the city will pay its debts. Yeah, that's actually not a bad one, because it's like, well, what is the city other than its people, you know? And if everybody pays their debts, then the city will pay their debts. The city is nothing but its people. But it's like, well, wait a minute, you know? That's true in one sense, but not in others. It's not in others. Yeah. Okay. Names of this collections or wholes are often used equivocally in that such names and their modifying adjectives may refer to each of the members or parts of a class, or to the class as a whole. When an inference is made from the properties of the parts of a whole, considered individually, to properties of the whole considered organically or collectively, it is said that the fallacy of composition has been committed. For what is true of each of the parts may not hold true at all for the whole. So you could say, everyone in this city, here's a kind of a sophism version of it. Everyone in the city has a head or two arms, let's say. Well, that's stupid. Everybody in the city is alive, and the city is nothing but its people. Therefore, the city is alive. And it's like, well, you know. When an inference is made from the properties of the parts of a whole considered individually to properties of the whole, we already did this. An example of this fallacy occurs when one reasons that each member of a football team is a good player, and that therefore the team as a whole is a good team. That's a better example than what I came up with. That a team consisting of all good players need not be a good team is obvious when we consider that all-star teams, composed presumably of the best individual college players, perhaps are seldom the best college teams in the nation. There's some je ne sais quoi. You can't just have franchise players. You need what makes a good team is something that's maybe different than just the stats. Moneyball theory of fallacy. Cohen and Nagel regard the fallacy of composition as one of a number of special forms resulting from the ambiguous use of words, and explain, for the same word may have a different significance when applied to a totality than it has when applied to an element. Well, that's interesting. So that's kind of like a way of reading this as fallacy as a version of maybe equivocation, right? You can see there's a lot of overlap here, but that's one way to interpret why this happens. Thus, the fact that the soldiers of a given regiment are all strong does not justify the conclusion that the regiment, which they constitute, is strong. The word strong does not mean the same in two cases. So, same thing with the team, so that the team might not be good because what makes a team good is that it wins. An individual player can never win on their own in a football. Same thing with soldiers. Soldiers might be strong. The way we measure the strength of a soldier, we might have lots of different ways of doing that. The strength of a regiment is going to have something to do maybe with battle or combat, which is not going to be the way we measure individual soldiers, right? So maybe that is a good way of thinking about this fallacy sometimes. The fallacy is sometimes mentioned in books on formal logic in a different connection, as when Quine, in a footnote to the distinction between class membership and class inclusion, say it occurs in a tentative form in traditional logic as a distinction between distributive and collective predication. So what do we mean by predication? Predication is when I just say something of something else. If I say, X is strong, the predicate there is strong. So if I say all the soldiers are strong, do I mean that in a distributive way where I'm basically saying each of them is strong, or I am saying that all of them taken as a class are strong? These are two different kind of logical ideas drawn to resolve the fallacies of composition and division. Peter is an apostle, the apostles are 12, therefore Peter is 12. There are some differences to be noted between the above examples. Copy, in fact, says that there are two related varieties of fallacy with the same name. The first is reasoning fallaciously from the properties of parts of a whole to the properties of the whole itself. And, where did it go? And a particularly flagrant example would be to argue that since every part of a machine is light in weight, the machine as a whole is light in weight. That is a useful example, because you could be like, putting all the parts together is always going to increase the weight. So we can't think about these predicates as being the same at the distributive or at the collective level. The second is reasoning from properties possessed by individual members of a collection to properties possessed by the class or collection as a whole. Quine's examples come from this rubric, and Copy distinguishes between the two kinds of predication involved, respectively in the statements, rodents have 4 feet, and rodents are widely distributed over the earth. Can you see the difference here between these two, between like the collective and distributive predication? So I would say that even though the word distributed is in this one, this is actually the example of collective predication. Rodents, as a class, are widely distributed over the earth. Each rodent is widely distributed over the earth doesn't make sense. Like, what are we talking about? Here, if we say rodents, each have 4 feet. Rodents as a class have 4 feet. Doesn't seem as egregious of an error, but it would be kind of a weird way to put it. So it's not really that way. So this is the distributive predication here. Rodents each have 4 feet. If we can put the word each in, then we're dealing with distribution. The example of Cohen and Nagel about strong soldiers making up a strong regiment is quite different, however, if, as suggested, the word has two different senses as its two occurrences. The point of the distinction between distributive and collective predication is rather that, even without alteration of the sense of individual words, there may be two senses of a general sentence taken as a whole. Esterly gives the traditional example, 3 and 2 are odd and even. 5 is 3 and 2. Therefore, 5 is odd and even. This is a great one. I actually really like this one. Again, this is a sophism in the sense that it's deliberately designed, Though at the time that Aristotle was writing it, the sophists would use these in actual disputations, these kinds of things, because the people that were in the disputations were kind of playing a game. And if you lost the game, it was like, too bad. It doesn't matter if you believe it or not. So that's kind of where the idea of heuristic comes from, these dialectical games that some people wanted to play in a tricky way. And the idea that you need to refute them is because, hey, you want to play these games? This is how you win. How you get out of these traps. Exactly how we are to analyze this argument, which may have been matter for furious debate between Socrates and some of his sophist sparring partners, but can hardly have aroused many strong emotions since the turn of the 4th century BC, is not clear. But certainly, numerical addition on which it depends is not to be confused either with the putting together of parts into a whole or with the collection of individuals into a class. Actually, a careful reading of Aristotle suggests that he thinks of the fallacy of composition in a much more simple-minded way, as arising in connection with the different ways of grouping words together in a sentence. So he's throwing a little shade at Aristotle of just being like, how we understand this fallacy is different from Aristotle's understanding. Aristotle's understanding is almost this is, as he has classified it, coming from words themselves. And is this actually a fallacy that belongs to language, or is it a kind of inference problem about the matter itself? Even that classification that seemed like pretty reliable so far starts to break down a little bit here around this, maybe. In a paper in which he refers to Copy's account of the fallacy, Rowe, the fallacy of composition, raises the general question of the validity of arguments of the form, all the parts of X have phi, therefore X has phi, where phi is a property of some kind. In some cases, an argument of this form seems to be perfectly valid. All the parts of this machine are made of metal, therefore this machine is made of metal. Right? That makes sense. Or all the parts of this chair are red, therefore this chair is red. In other cases, such as all the parts of the machine are light in weight, therefore this machine is light in weight, the invalidity is obvious. Rowe suggests the distinction between the two cases rests in the fact that when a fallacy is committed, there's an ambiguity in the property word here being light or red or metal, the thing that's being predicated. What it is, for example, for a machine as a whole to be light in weight is a different thing from what it is for a part of a machine to be light in weight. The word light, that is a relative word, and the fallacy that is committed is really a special case of the fallacy of equivocation. So we're back to that. So what do we mean by relative words? Well, something like light is, this is light in comparison to something that's heavy. That's a judgment that's relative between two quantities. Sometimes these are called dialectical terms. Something is dark in compared to something that, again, light. Something is cold in comparison to something that's hot. So those seem like qualities that we attribute to things. In natural language, we do that all the time. But we might distinguish that from something that we could call having a positive quality or a positive term, like red. So these are terms that don't have obvious opposites. Something like red, what's the opposite of red? And I know you can get out your color wheel and do some color theory. That's not really the point. The point is that different kind of inferences follow from the classes of predicates that we might have. And this is where some people really get kind of hung up, because they'll try to be like, oh, we're on the trail here. And then they try to create all the different classes of predicates and stuff. And they write maybe 90,000 Latin words about it. And are we better off than when we began? Maybe in some cases. But now we've had to invent a whole metaphysics in order to understand this riddle. And it's like, who had the better of the argument here? The sophist or the guy who ended up writing a whole book about the argument, about why he didn't actually lose it? So anyway, we could dispose of this suggestion by substituting the predicate weighs less than 1 pound for is light in weight. But the problem remains of distinguishing the predicates for which the argument is valid from those for which it is not. Richard Cole suggests that so long as predicates work and others do not, as some predicates work and others do not, we must insist that in strict logic, an additional premise is necessary of the form. Say, when all the parts of a chair are a certain color, the chair is that color. And that it is only when the appropriate additional premise is false that the argument fails. This seems too easy a move. So what's being described here is okay, you can't just say, even here where it seems like it works, all the parts of this chair are red, therefore this chair is red. You have to say first, okay, all the parts of the chair are red. Then, when all the parts of a chair are a certain color, the chair is that color. And I think Hamblin is gonna make the argument of being this just kind of wishes away the problem. By adding in another premise, you're yeah, that would solve the problem, but it's how do we know when this premise should come in or not? That doesn't really solve the problem. It just kind of solves a certain appearance of the problem. But anyway, this seems too easy a move. Used generally, it would make every fallacy of whatever kind a formal one. In the present case, the issue will turn on whether the additional premise is to be regarded as a necessary truth, and hence redundant, or not. It is worthwhile remarking, however, that we sometimes need to distinguish physical collections, like piles of sand, from functional collections, like football teams, and these in turn from conceptual collections, like the totality of butterflies. So we do get into a little bit of metaphysics here, even with Hamblin. He's can't avoid it. Within each of these categories, there are subcategories. These distinctions are different from the ones already made. So the physical collections like piles of sand, another famous logical paradox is called the Sorites paradox, which is about piles of sand. And the way that it goes is I say, okay, let's play the most boring game that could be possibly imagined. I have a bunch of sand over here, and I'm going to move one grain of sand at a time over towards you. Okay, every time I move a grain of sand in this fun game, every time I move a grain of sand to take a shot, that would be too fun of a game. Every time I move a grain of sand, I'm going to say, is it a pile now? And a certain, for a while, you're going to be able to say no pretty confidently. And after a very long while, you might be able to say yes very confidently, but there's going to be some in-between moment where you're not sure what to say. And this is called the Sorites paradox. Like, is there going to be a moment where it goes from no, 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 not a pile to yes? Is there going to be a clear moment? That leads to all sorts of other paradoxes. It can be kind of shown that there isn't going to be a clear moment. Well, if there's no clear moment, then is there a period where it's neither a pile nor not a pile? That's confusing, at least to Western logic. Again, the Indian logic is useful here because there are Indian logical systems which would make that not a problem. 4 valued logics. So in the Western tradition, most logic is 2 valued, meaning that things can be true or they can be false. In some logics that developed from the Indian tradition, you have 4 valued logics: true, false, neither true nor false. So that might be the Sorites paradox. Or both true and false, which is a pretty wild one. Yeah. So this kind of develops partly out of the interaction of different religious traditions there, including the Buddhist tradition in India. Okay. The fallacy of division is supposed to be the reverse of the fallacy of composition and to arise from the illicit replacement of a statement about a whole with a statement about its parts, rather than the other way around. Since to confuse A with B is the same thing as to confuse B with A, it usually takes at most a little rewording to convert an example of composition into an example of division, or vice versa. Formally, an argument from A to B is always exactly as valid or as invalid as the argument from the contradictory of B to the contradictory of A. And although non-formal features of an argument make it possible to distinguish the two, there is no particular point in doing so since the considerations. Okay, blah, 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 blah. Let's now not look at accent. I'm just going to tell you what's going on with accent. And this is kind of a holdover of the linguistic side of... He actually spends quite a bit of time on accent. Maybe I'll look at one of the English examples he gives. But in Greek, in ancient Greek anyway, accent was a way of pronouncing a word that, like in a tonal language, like in Chinese today, there are 4 different tones that you might say that would change the meaning of a word. That is pretty much what is happening in ancient Greek: acute, grave, circumflex. And then the Latin logicians tried to make this work for Latin in a weird way and stuff. So if you really are a fallacy head and you really want to get into fallacies, you can read about these kinds of things. But I would say they're basically the same thing as equivocation, but equivocation that's based in pronunciation. So he gives the example of incense versus incense. So to incense someone is to make them angry. Incense is something that we burn to make things smell good, right? These are obviously 2 different things. So yeah, I'm not going to worry too much about that. That's just more equivocation. Figure of speech. This is the last of Aristotle's 6 fallacies dependent on language. It consists in being deceived by the misleading structure or etymology of a word. Very few modern writers even bother to mention it. Their difficulty, if they do so, is to find serious examples of it. Joseph illustrates it with the apparent passivity of, "I am resolved what to do," which suggests that a man's resolution is not his own free act, and with the apparent negativity of important, which has the same prefix as the genuinely negative imperturbable, or impenitent. And he refers in a footnote to a lady who has once observed, "The question is he a postor or an impostor?" That's pretty funny. You can't just always take a negative prefix off. There isn't always a thing that corresponds to that. Or as sometimes people like to point out, some words mean the same thing. Like something that's flammable and something that's inflammable are both things that can be burnt, which is kind of weird. So language is weird in this way. I am resolved what to do. This is not, I don't think, a particularly interesting one, but it has to do with the passive voice, right? So, I am resolved makes it seem like something has happened to you. Well, resolving something or deciding that you're doing something, we usually interpret as an active thing, an act of the will. So the fact that you can put it in a passive voice suggests something potentially misleading is going on. Maybe, I don't know. It was given to J.S. Mill to make the greatest of modern contributions to this fallacy by perpetrating a serious example of it himself. This is my favorite. I love this one because he's going to rip on Mill for a minute. John Stuart Mill as you can see, the text is called Utilitarianism, is a major philosopher, or was a major philosopher in the 19th century of utilitarianism. Very powerful, important guy. Also important in the history of logic, because his work on inductive logic as opposed to deductive logic is often cited as one of the major contributions to the science of logic, or the logic of science, or both, I guess, in his own time. But here's what he says here. The only proof capable of being given that an object is visible is that people actually see it. Okay? The only proof that a sound is audible is that people hear it. And so of the other sources of our experience. In like manner, I apprehend, the sole evidence it is possible to produce that anything is desirable is that people do actually desire it. That seems about right. Huh, interesting. Huh. It's the kind of argument that makes you go, huh. So why is this a fallacy? But to say that something is visible or audible is to say that people can see it or hear it. Whereas to say that something is desirable is to say that it is worthy of desire. Plainly, a good thing. Mill is misled by the termination able. So these, even though it's the form of the word kind of makes us feel like the inference should be the same, but these are different meanings of a word. Just I could say that this thing is desirable, but no one desires it yet because we don't know enough about it. If people knew about it, right, they would desire it more. There are lots of different reasons being like it ought to be desired, but it's not. And I wouldn't say it ought to be seen, but it's not, is what visible means. So it's this difference in meaning that is being called here figure of speech, the figure of speech fallacy. How did the phrase figure of speech get into the language? Aristotle was apparently not the first to use it, but borrowed it from earlier rhetorical teachings. It was probably first used by the sophist Gorgias. Gorgias, my boy. It has had a variety of meanings in rhetoric and grammar before giving us in modern times the word figurative to describe metaphor. Logicians usually do not know what to say about metaphor. Anime, sweat bead, metaphor, logician, and are content to let grammarians and ordinary men have this use to themselves. It's funny because there have been attempts for logicians to treat metaphor. Usually what they go to is analogy. Most of the logical understanding of metaphor is analogical. And you can see why, because analogies are set up as ratios. And maybe if you've done some of these bad tests with analogies on them, you can kind of see like X is to Y as A is to B. So this gives a kind of logical form. But how do you deal with everything that metaphors mean to people in logic? You probably can't. It kind of opens onto a field that's more infinite and continuous and less kind of finite and discrete. And mathematical thinking, of course, can deal with the infinite and the continuous, but logic tends to deal with the finite and the discrete when we're treating things that we understand as logic in language. So this might be one of the other limitations of logic, is that its ability to represent linguistic meaning is limited to things that are themselves understood as kind of finite and discrete, and language may not always work that way. Okay, accident. Oh no, I spilled the milk. Well, not that kind of accident, as we'll find out quickly. Leaving Aristotle's first group of fallacies, we turn to fallacies outside language. And again, I don't really love outside language. I've decided they're fallacies that are not simply about the wording. Let's say that. On starting to look at examples, we could be pardoned for thinking that the change of genus is not going to make much difference. And much streaming. Hey, sorry if I went out there for a second. You can tell me whether it did or didn't. I don't know what happened, if it did, but we're going to keep going. I don't think we missed too much, but okay. This doesn't work very well in English because this dog is father. It's just not a sentence that, I mean, except for the joke that I made about this dog is mother, we would say this dog is a father. And then we couldn't say this dog is your father, because we would say this dog is your a father, which doesn't make any sense. So this is a verbal pun as flagrant as any of the fallacies dependent on language. Anyway, this does work in some languages that don't have as much reliance on English articles as we do, like and the. Though Greek has a lot of articles, but they work differently. So, anyway, Cohen and Nagel, in fact, put the fallacy of accident and the following fallacy of secundum quid under the heading semi-logical or verbal fallacies. This would have been inappropriate for accident, or as originally understood, though somewhat less so for secundum quid. which we'll get to in a minute. It is not at all out of line with some modern treatments. Oh my gosh. I don't know why my nose always itches when I do these streams. I think like talking a lot, talking even more than I usually do, makes my nose itch. Anyway, that doesn't matter. The name accident is a doctrine-bound one, which turns on a particular analysis by Aristotle of a class of controversial examples. In theory, these fallacies arise from taking an accidental property to be an essential one, and it is this that most of the books take as their starting point. Unfortunately, it is often difficult to say of a property whether it is essential or not, and few people these days would be prepared to go so far as to maintain generally that the essential properties of every kind of thing can be uniquely specified. I mean, I play this kind of game in my classes sometimes where we'll do definitional work and I'll say, okay, well, what's the quality that distinguishes human beings from animals? And people will come up with lots of different things. And in the ancient theory of logic, well, they would say, okay, well, there might be things that are special to the class. You know, we might be the only animals with opposable thumbs, or we might be the only animals with technology. But what's our essential quality? What's the one that's kind of not just special to us, but essential to us? I think a lot of people would just be like, I don't know what the difference is. Because we are more modern people, we don't have the same kind of philosophical assumptions as these earlier peoples may have. But that's one way to understand what they're talking about here about the essential. Oh man, everything's going wrong now. I have to go plug in my computer. Hold on one moment. One moment. Okay. I forget how battery life just... Okay. But anyway, let's keep going. Yeah. So Esterle, for example, argues that racialism in politics is due to the mistaken belief that skin color and similar racial characteristics are essential properties of those who bear them. Like, that's a pretty serious kind of fallacy, right? To be like, oh, people's essence is their skin color. It is difficult to know what this means. If it is that these characteristics should never be taken into account for any purpose, it is plainly at variance with common sense and would rule out good differential treatment along with bad. Moreover, two can play at the game of essentialism, and it is not at all clear how someone who claims that a given property is not an essential one will be able to argue that against someone else who claims that it is. A charge of fallacy may simply be returned to the sender. So I think kind of Hamblin's position here is that, like, we can't make heads or tails of this distinction between a predicate that's essential and one that's not. So I think I kind of agree with that, though I'm a little bit more sympathetic to the idea of what it means for someone to say this as being meaningful for good or bad reasons. But it is a kind of metaphysical claim that maybe we just don't need to kind of worry about so much anymore. It comes up in science sometimes, though, and certain scientific claims about what things really are. We'll be like, well, here's the predicate that makes something what it really is. So here's an example that is that water is H2O. That is what it is essentially. And H2O, or we'd say water, I should say, water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. Okay. That much seems kind of true. Oh, well, you have to adjust it for atmospheric pressure and things like that. But if you took perfectly distilled H2O at normal atmospheric pressure, it still wouldn't boil at 100 degrees Celsius, which is one of these weird things, one of these weird results. Because that boiling point of water has something to do with the dissolved gases that are contained within water that are not H2O. So trying to kind of get to the purity of something may lead to paradoxes and fallacies regardless. So maybe we do need a little bit of metaphysics. My metaphysics would be that of sunyata. Everything is empty of selfhood. This kind of pure notion of an essential quality that will capture what a thing is just will never work. But you can keep trying. Why not? A charge of fallacy may simply be returned to the sender. Okay. Speaking relatively instead of absolutely, we might say that racial differences are essential for certain purposes, unessential for others. I mean, that's pretty funny, but like that kind of undoes what a lot of people mean by essence, which is essence is true for all purposes. If you say, this is essential sometimes, that's kind of my speed. I like that. But that, to me, feels a little bit witty. And he seems to present it as very straightforward, straight-faced way of saying that. But if we speak this way, we can no longer provide so simple a rationale for the fallacy of accident. Consequently, an alternative, slightly different rationale is often provided. Copy says, the fallacy of accident consists in applying a general rule to a particular case, whose accidental circumstances render the rule inapplicable. Should we pay our debts? Yes, as a general rule, but there are exceptional situations in which the obligation lapses. And one of the famous examples here is, should you pay your debts? Well, what if a friend has entrusted a weapon with you, on loan or whatever, and they come back and they're kind of enraged or in a fit of madness? Should you pay back the debt and return the weapon to them? A lot of good common sense would say no. But then doesn't that violate the principle of debt obligation? Blah, 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 blah. The word accidental, however, is not really appropriate as a characterization of the exceptional situations, and it could be omitted without loss from Copy's description, as he nearly acknowledges by replacing it in quotes. What we call a general rule, if it is not, as we might prefer, an absolutely universal one, is one which holds most of the time, in general, normal, or usual circumstances. But this is not to say that it depends on essential properties of things, or that they are accidents. And again, I think Hamblin is right. This is all a holdover of Aristotle's metaphysics, which is part of his logic. His logic, even though it's been surpassed, people are still kind of indebted to it in certain ways, has this idea of a metaphysical interpretation of the world where there are some things that are essential and some things that are accidental that leads to these paradoxes. So it's Aristotle's fault. Let's just say that. This change in interpretation brings the fallacy of accident close in character to the next one in the list. We shall turn in the next chapter to Plato's paternal dog. That's when he was talking about, okay, you got it. Secundum quid. Secundum quid, Greek paratope, means in a certain respect, and refers to the qualifications which may be attached to a term or generalization. Fallacies secundum quid are those which involve neglect of necessary qualifications. That's a really nice way to put what this fallacy is about. Neglect of necessary qualifications, right? Okay, good. Keep that in mind. Copy's quoted description of the fallacy of accident puts it firmly in this category. It is sometimes said, following De Morgan, that the two kinds of fallacy are converses, and that whereas accident is argument from general to inappropriate particular, secundum quid is invalid argument from particular to general. However, in view of the ease with which an argument may be cast into different forms, the distinction is a little artificial. If someone argues that alcohol is bad because it causes drunkenness, there may be in his argument some kind of movement of meaning. But the direction of the movement is not clear until we determine which of the two statements, alcohol is bad and alcohol causes drunkenness, is to be regarded as a strictly universal generalization and which as a qualified one. So one way to kind of understand all of the complicated things that are being said here is a very simple one, is we often speak in a way where we don't qualify what we say explicitly. But we assume that the normal human being that will hear us say this wouldn't take it as an absolute, totally unqualified statement. The vast majority of speech would be impossible if we were to attribute everything literally and absolutely in its meaning. Everything that we would normally say would become false at some remove. Alcohol causes drunkenness, we'd be like, yeah, that's true. Because what we mean is alcohol can cause drunkenness. Not that it always does in every application and every use cause drunkenness. That would be absurd. So, okay, that's what we're talking about here. Underlying the difficulty is a more serious one, which we shall have to face in due course. Hasty generalization, as Copy described what is apparently intended to be this fallacy, is a common logical sin, but logicians themselves are far from being agreed on criteria for what are called inductive arguments. It has been seriously argued by Hume and others that every argument from particular cases to a general rule must be fallacious, so that it is impossible to survey and to know that one has surveyed all the particular cases the generalization covers. So if we talk about inductive argument, if you're in my class, we've already done this. We've already kind of done this with a game and a few other things. If you held inductive argument to the standards of deductive argument, it makes sense to say that every inductive argument is fallacious. But that would also be weird because we're saying that these are two different forms of inference, so we can't really do that. And you can see why this is a problem for logicians, because logicians' bread and butter is deductive reasoning. They don't really, they're still, even though it's kind of like we're about 300, 400 years into the serious recognition of inductive inference and reasoning as part of logic. It's still not nearly as developed in its theory or in the level of agreement. And mostly, I think, because it's trickier. Like, there's just more to consider. There's more stuff that needs to be worked out. But also maybe more things that can't be worked out, that just you have to go with your gut on of what makes a good inductive argument. How much error or how much kind of uncertainty are you willing to admit into inference? And if you say none at all, well, then you just aren't interested in induction. That you can't do it. There has to be some allowance for uncertainty or error. We seem to have a double logical standard, one set of criteria for deductive arguments and another for inductive ones. If so, there are two sets of criteria for fallacy as well. And I would say that is one of the ways that this gets resolved. There are people called informal logicians who are like, well, we're going to talk about fallacies based on, kind of inductive arguments, and they're going to be a little less formal than the deductive ones. That's fine, whatever. Most or all generalizations are deductively unjustified. But we have a need for other criteria which will enable us to distinguish between the two hasty ones and the relatively reliable. As long ago as the Port Royal logic, an attempt was made to supplement the traditional, so this is the 17th century, this is people who are following Descartes and are trying to use Descartes' system and to create a logic out of it, just to give you a sense of how long ago that is. With some discussion of unjustified inductions, and Mill's account of fallacies is strongly oriented, at least superficially, in that direction. For whatever reason, these attempts to remedy a deficiency of the traditional scheme have been dropped by most recent writers. I wonder what that reason is. Professionalization of philosophy. And all that remains is some brief reference under other headings. The fallacy of secundum quid was never designed to carry this kind of load and does so uneasily. The distinction between a qualified and a strictly universal generalization is of minor importance in discussions of induction and vice versa. We shall need later to investigate the relationship between them, but only after putting both into historical context. An interesting and entirely typical illustration of the ossification of the traditional treatment of fallacy. Ossification means like the hardening, literally the making into bone of the traditional treatment of fallacies in modern times concerns the example, what you bought yesterday, you eat today. You bought raw meat yesterday, therefore you eat raw meat today. Which appears first in the 12th century Munich Dialectica, and is usually regarded as an example of secundum quid, but is given in some modern books as an example of accident. We have already noticed that there is not much difference between the two categories. However, the reclassification of the example can almost certainly be put down not to conscious design, but to historical mistake. Writers of textbooks take their examples from one another. So De Morgan had written, this is actually, I think, too in the weeds. You can read it if you want, but this is like inside baseball stuff, I would say, about this particular one. So let's move on to ignoratio elenchi, or misconception of refutation. The traditional term ignoratio elenchi means ignorance of refutation. Esterly translated as ignoring the issue, and Black, Copy, and Schipper and Schuh as irrelevant conclusion. Aristotle shows that he means it to refer to cases in which, through the lack of logical acumen, an arguer thinks he has proved one thing, but has at best proved something else. The journey has been safely performed, says Sidgwick, only we have gotten to the wrong train. Ha ha ha. So you can see that this is like, it's already kind of a hodgepodge. Like this one kind of refers to an almost interpersonal dispute, which would make sense if you were thinking, as Aristotle's in his context was, with these disputations between sophists and philosophers. But some of the other ones don't seem like they rely on that context at all. So yeah, this traditional classification scheme is pretty hodgepodge in that way. But let's see what they mean. So described, this category can be stretched to cover virtually every kind of fallacy, or it can be restricted to clear cases of misinterpretation of the thesis. Schipper and Schuh treat it frankly as a ragbag and say, many arguments in which the premises are irrelevant to the conclusion cannot be classified properly under any of the foregoing headings. It will prove convenient, therefore, simply to call these fallacies of irrelevant conclusion, using this as the title of a miscellaneous or catch-all category of fallacies of relevance. Schipper and Schuh's other fallacies of relevance are the ad hominem, the ad verecundiam, and other arguments ad something or other. We shall deal with these separately. They are peculiar in that they represent specious attempts, usually emotional, to persuade an audience, and Aristotle's examples are not like them at all. Copey says, an example may be stated in cold, aseptic, neutral language and still commit the fallacy of irrelevant conclusion. However, I have not been able to find in modern books any examples fitting this description. The prosecuting counsel in a murder case argues irrelevantly that murder is a horrible crime. A liberal education is not practical because it does not result immediately in a cash dividend. Imagine if people thought that was a fallacy. Wow. Could you imagine a time when people thought that was a fallacy? This is the idea that runs the university now. Opponents of federal health insurance plans demonstrate the dangers, ! Of socialized medicine programs of Great Britain or Sweden. Whether the Lockean categories are included or not, the name ignoratio elenchi inadequately characterizes these examples, and since there are no other modern examples for it to characterize, it has no modern justification. I shall later prefer the term misconceptions of refutation in referring to the earliest accounts of this fallacy. Let me try to give you what I think is a better understanding of why this might be relevant as a way of thinking about certain kinds of fallacies. I'm going to use a kind of ancient legal example. In one of the high courts, the Areopagus in ancient Athens, which Aristotle was aware of and was concerned with, there was a law that says, in this particular court, nothing outside of the matter itself is allowed. You can't make any arguments outside of the matter itself. And so what this would prevent would be something like, it was supposed to prevent, if someone was charged with murder, let's say, and you had to make a defense, the defense would be like, I didn't commit the murder. That would be what would be relevant. Sometimes people would come in and say things like this: I'm a father. If you convict me of this crime, look at all my children that are there. They're going to not be able to do anything without me. You're going to make orphans of them. Okay, again, this is another fallacy called ad misericordiam, specifically an appeal to pity. But why is pity here a fallacy? Not because pity is an emotion, but because pity is being replaced with what is supposed to be being talked about, which is the relevant question. So that's why it's a kind of fallacy of relevance. I think that maybe that's a more helpful way of understanding what's going on here. Begging the question. Well, people will say this phrase all the time, and in a way that is not about the fallacy at all. It has become, when people just say, oh, that begs the question, what they usually mean is it just makes them curious. It just makes them wonder about something. That is not what begging the question means in the study of fallacies. And I have to say, begging the question is a bad translation of the original Latin phrase. So sometimes it's better to keep things in the Latin. The origin and meaning of the phrase beg the question and its Latin and Greek counterparts have proved a problem to many writers and their readers. To everybody. Some interesting etymologies have been proposed. I recall that I used to think beg the question was a corruption of beggar the question, not unlike a 12th century colleague who had trouble making sense of the Latin petitio and translated it as it repetitio. An 18th century French textbook refers to petition de principe from the Greek word petomai, which means to fly towards something, and the Latin word principium, which means beginning. Thus, to commit a petition de principe is to run back in new words to the same thing as was originally in dispute. In fact, beg the question is a reasonably accurate translation of Aristotle's original Greek, to en arche aitaistai. In place of aitaistai, Aristotle also sometimes used the word lambanein, to assume, provided we suitably interpret the word question. The phrase in the original actually means something like beg for that which is in the question at issue. Even that's still really confusing. The Latin principium petera is the Vulgate translation of this, and beg the question has been accepted English one at least since the 16th century. Nevertheless, Webster's dictionary still translates petitio principii as postulation of the beginning, and to balance one sin with another gives evade as a synonym of beg. The arrangement of fallacies in Shipper and Shoe suggests that these authors failed to realize that beg the question is connected with petitio principii. In fact, I would say they are the same fallacy. Under the general headings fallacies of presumption, they explain, the presumptive arguments are sometimes called question begging, because by smuggling the conclusion into the wording of the premises, they beg or avoid the question at issue in the argument. Note the gloss or avoid. There are 4 separate kinds of fallacy of presumption listed, including complex question yet to be discussed. The 4th is circular reasoning, sometimes called vicious circle argument, or by its Latin name, petitio principii. This is an involved confusion of terminology. apart from anything else, a vicious circle is one involving self-contradiction or self-defeat, as in the paradox of the liar. Okay, so if a vicious circle is the one in which the premises undermine themselves, begging the question is the one in which we claim that we have proved something where we have. So it's an example of circularity in reasoning, maybe, but not the vicious circle. Okay, we're trying to keep all these terms clear as best we can. Why beg? We shall understand this better when we come to put it in the context of disputation on the Greek pattern, as Aristotle originally intended it. If one person sets out to argue a case to another, he may ask to be granted certain premises on which to build. Be like, would you grant me this? Yes. Okay, this is the dialectical procedure. So if you grant me this, then this follows. Yes. The fallacy consists in asking to be granted the question at issue, which one is set out to prove. What makes the phrase confusing is that modern examples are so seldom presented as specimens of lifelike disputations. Keynes says, making a distinction that has not occurred before in this discussion, that begging the question is a fallacy of proof rather than a fallacy of inference. That is a nice distinction. Apparently to ward off the criticism that there is nothing wrong with inferring something from itself unless it is accompanied by a claim to have proved something. So this is also a problem for formal logic because the implication of something kind of implying itself is actually axiomatic for logic. So if this is a fallacy in terms of logic, they would also say that logic itself is fallacious. We don't want to say that, at least if we're logicians. We don't want to say that P implies P is fallacious because that is an axiom of, most systems of logic. If there really is a distinction between fallacies of proof and fallacies of inference, it should, of course, be made generally and used as a feature of classification, but nobody has done this. Hamblin's so spicy. He's like is a huge nerd, right? He's like going through all these minor distinctions, but he loves to throw shade around, especially this chapter is the shadiest, I think. The name begging the question is often extended to cases in which, although the precise point in dispute is not itself assumed as a premise, something equally questionable is assumed in its place. Abraham Franz has, petitio principii then is either when the same thing is proved by itself, as the soul is immortal because it never dieth. That's not a bad example, right? Because it never dieth is just saying that it's immortal. It's just another way of saying it. It doesn't really prove anything. Or when a doubtful thing is confirmed by that which is as doubtful as the earth moveth because the heaven standeth still. That's a weirder one, and I'm going to ignore it. Whately is a little more explicit when he defines it as that in which one of the premises either is manifestly the same in sense with the conclusion, or is actually proved from it, or is such as the persons you are addressing are not likely to know or to admit, except as an inference from the conclusion. Curiously, the commonest example in the modern books has a twist to it, which prevents either of these definitions from clearly capturing it. Cohen and Nagel say it would be arguing in a circle to try to prove the infallibility of the Quran by the proposition that it was composed by God's prophet, Muhammad. If the truth about Muhammad's being God's prophet depends upon the authority of the Quran. Black has in essence the same example in the shape of a dialogue between a man and his bank manager. My friend Jones will vouch for me. How do we know he can be trusted? Oh, I assure you he can. So it's like there's this kind of circularity in the proof. And I think here they use the Quran because they probably at this time they didn't want to say it about the Bible. But you can hear this argument being made when people will be like, God is real. We know this because the Bible tells us so. And be like, well, how do you know the Bible is real? Be like, well, it's divinely inspired by God's word. It's like, well, okay, that doesn't mean that you can't believe that, but the proof is circular. The argument is circular, right? You could go in another direction where a certain kind of strain of philosophy has gone and to say, at some very basic level, the truth is circular. The truth is not incisive. The truth is circular. So you're going to eventually arrive at circularity in reasoning at some point, which makes people a little bit uncomfortable. Because if you want the truth to be logical, the circularity of that kind of... So once we get down really to the basic level of things, these things that we always associate, logic, truth, reason... Either we have to kind of change our conceptions of them, or we have to say that their relationship to each other maybe isn't what we thought it was. But that is kind of like deep philosophical speculation that's maybe a place that we would get it if we spent thinking about these things for a long time, not what we would normally arrive at in everyday conversation, or even in kind of scientific or scholarly or serious conversation of some kind. We probably wouldn't usually be thinking in those terms. Okay. So Copy refers to the argument that Shakespeare is greater than Spillane because people with good taste prefer him. The good taste being demonstrated by the fact that they like Shakespeare. Okay, thanks. All these arguments are at least partly arguments from authority. And elsewhere in their discussions, most of the authors concerned point out the arguments from authority are to be distinguished from arguments on the merits of case, and are even perhaps essentially fallacious themselves. We shall discuss the merits of arguments from... I went too far. From authority later. But this is a complication that one would expect to be absent from textbook. Prototypes of another fallacy. However, by far the most important controversy surrounding petitio principii concerns J.S. Mill's claim that all valid reasoning commits this fallacy. Cohen and Nagel touch on this when they say, there is a sense in which all science is circular, as I was kind of just saying. For all proof rests upon assumptions that are not derived from others, but are justified by a set of consequences which are deduced from them. So you could think about this even in terms of mathematics or logic, the axiomatization of these things. You have to kind of start with a positing something. Okay, I gotta ban you. All right. But there's a difference between a circle consisting of a small number of propositions, from which we can escape by denying them all or setting up their contradictories, and the circle of theoretical science and human observation, which is so wide, which we cannot set up any alternative to it. Apparently, a fallacy is not objectionable so long as it is big enough. This is, however, a serious philosophical assertion, and we must discuss about it in a later chapter, so not in this one. So this kind of the big philosophy thing I was talking about. Is the truth a circle? Oh well, we're not going to figure it out here, not today. Affirming the consequent. Now this is a major fallacy, this is an important one. This is a deductive fallacy. This fallacy, as Aristotle explains, arises because people suppose that the relation of consequence is convertible. For suppose whenever A is, B necessarily is, they then suppose that if B is, A necessarily is. Right? Like, okay, well that makes sense. It can be shown very clearly that this is not the case. What's the one I usually use? If it's raining, the ground is wet. Okay? If the ground is wet, it's raining. Not necessarily. Someone might have just like taken a hose out and sprayed off some sidewalk chalk, right? So things don't kind of convert necessarily in that way. A relation is convertible if its two terms can be validly interchanged. We need not hang too much on Aristotle's word necessarily. The ordinary form of reasoning from S implies T and S is true to T is true is commonly called modus ponens. And the fallacy of the consequent is generally regarded as the backwards version of this, from S implies T and T is true to S is true. This will be familiar to you if you're in my class, and if not, you can kind of look it up. You can see the kind of diagrams of affirming the consequent as in formal logic. Copy, for example, says, one must not confuse the valid form modus ponens with the clearly invalid form displayed by the following argument. If Bacon wrote Hamlet, then Bacon was a great writer. Bacon was a great writer, therefore Bacon wrote Hamlet. Okay, well, that doesn't make any sense, right? Well, that's because it's affirming the consequent. The consequent we can see, one way we can think about remember the consequent is the thing that comes after the then. If, then. If we say that the then is true here, now this sentence is saying then is true, then we say that the if part is true, and that just doesn't work. Okay. The phrase affirming the consequent is not from Aristotle and goes back, I think, no further than Keynes, who, though he does not use it as a tag, says it is a fallacy to regard the affirmation of the consequent as justifying the affirmation of the antecedent. From the same source we get the concept of fallacy of denying the antecedent. Copy's example would commit this fallacy if it were turned round to read, if Bacon wrote Hamlet, then Bacon was a great writer. Bacon did not write Hamlet, therefore Bacon was not a great writer. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. In the previous case, the consequent, Bacon was a great writer if the hypothetical premise was affirmed as the second premise, and the antecedent, Bacon wrote Hamlet, invalidly inferred from it. In this case, the antecedent is denied in the second premise, and the denial of the consequent is equally validly inferred. If we instead said If Bacon wrote Hamlet, then Bacon was a great writer. We say Bacon was not a great writer, therefore Bacon did not write Hamlet. That would be validly true, but it would be wrong. Bacon was a great writer, unfortunately, we have to admit. Okay. All of our modern books identify and name this fallacy, but only one, the traditionalist Esterly, lists it in order with the other fallacies. The others treat it along with inferences of calculus of propositions. The divorce between fallacies and the rest of logic could hardly be more complete. As soon as a fallacy has some relation to the rest of logic, it is removed from its place in the chapter on fallacies. So because this is a deductive fallacy, people are like, it's not even a fallacy. It's a different kind of thing. There's a subtle difference between Aristotle's treatment and that of Stoic and modern writers, in that Aristotle gives us not examples with the hypothetical if-then formulation, but rather examples consistent with his syllogistic logic of class terms. We don't have to worry about that. This is something to do with the way that Aristotle treats logic versus, let's say, the Stoics. This is kind of too in the weeds. Let's go to the next one. False cause. Copy, after explaining that various analyses have been given to this fallacy, says, we shall regard any argument that incorrectly attempts to establish a causal connection as an instance of the fallacy of false cause. We are now classifying fallacies according to the kind of conclusion they have. Schipper and Shu continue. He's making fun of this, right? Because, again, Hamblin thinks all of this is kind of stupid. He doesn't like these classifications. He's just running through them. In practice, however, the false cause fallacy has come to mean a specific kind of illicit argument, that is, one which involves an inference from a merely temporal sequence of events to a causal sequence. The Latin expression for this fallacy precisely describes its nature. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. And I would say this is one of those that actually usually, I think, appears in the Latin. Even though it's kind of a long Latin phrase and maybe it seems a little intimidating. It just means after the thing, therefore because of the thing. Sort of. After this, because therefore, okay, that is. After this, therefore, because of this, yeah. Even so, this is puzzling. If we know that B always occurs after A, we are well on our way to setting up a causal law, and the precise difference between necessary connection and constant conjunction has been a matter of debate among philosophers, at least since Hume. Hasty or unwarranted generalizations have, moreover, always been prescribed in this list in the name of the fallacy of secundum quid. Yet the examples given by quoted authors, herb medicines curing colds, excursions under ladders ending in broken legs, rabbit's foot tokens securing pay rises, are clear examples of hasty generalizations whose main fault is that they proceed from temporal conjunctions were actually found not to be constant. I mean, if we establish scientifically that every person who has a rabbit's foot in their pocket gets a pay raise, we'd be like, well, maybe there is a causal connection. Now we have evidence for it. As in the case of some previous fallacies, the mystery is why logicians should think it worthwhile to preserve an incoherent tradition. So he's very kind of down on post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacies. And I would agree. I mean, one of the issues here is people often will say, another version of this is people say, correlation is not causation. And I just saw someone make this claim in the comment of a video that was about the effectiveness of the DARE program. And the video was like, sure, drug use increased during and after DARE. But that doesn't mean that DARE failed, because correlation does not imply causation. You can't really ever know. And it's like, well, you're right. We can't really ever know anything about cause, which goes back to what he's talking about with David Hume, is like, if you take cause in some kind of absolute way, we will never have absolute knowledge. Most of our causal arguments have something to do with temporal sequence. Like, this thing follows that thing. So, more or less. So cause is an inductive thing, not a deductive thing, right? At least in the first instance. And that makes it kind of problematic. People really want to make causal arguments a lot of the time. So I would say it's hard to say that these are fallacies in a way that doesn't get us involved in a lot of qualifications. But there maybe are more egregious examples of it, where someone says simply because or merely because something follows from something else, or after something else in time, therefore it's a cause. I might say that that's kind of a fallacy because it's just a kind of weak way of making a causal argument. But whatever. The fallacy of many questions. Or, more comprehensibly, the fallacy of the complex question is most commonly illustrated by the question, have you stopped beating your wife? Which is, not a pleasant one, but I have heard that many times used as the example. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about questions that imply agreement to a proposition that has not been agreed to. And so if you answer the question, you get stuck. You'd be like, no, I haven't stopped beating my wife. Because maybe you mean like I never did. Now it sounds like, well, you're still beating your wife, right? Okay. rough stuff. Kind of stuff that you might use to trick people. Another example is Charles II's question to the Royal Society. Why a live fish placed in a bowl already full of water did not cause it to overflow, whereas a dead fish did so. He's like, he wants his kind of royal philosophers and scientists to go out and figure out this question. And they're kind of like, yeah, we have to figure out why this happens, except it doesn't. Except it's not true. The question is based on a premise that is false. There are all various different versions of the story, and Joseph's is not the original, and Whately has. The Royal Society were imposed on by being asked to account for the fact that a vessel of water received no addition to its weight by having a dead fish put into it. Why is this the case? And it's hard to tell the king that it's just not the case, right? So people are like, oh, they're twiddling their fingers, and they're itching their beards. On the occasion of the creation of the Royal Society, the king dined with its members and toward the close of the evening admitted, with that peculiar gravity of countenance he usually wore on such occasions, that among such learned men he had now hoped for a solution to a question that had long perplexed him. This is so funny. The case he thus stated, suppose 2 pails of water were fixed in 2 different scales that were equally poised, which weighed equally alike. Oh, I went too far again. And that 2 live bream or small fish were put into either of these pails. He wanted to know the reason why that pail with such addition should not weigh more than the other pail which stood against it. Everyone was ready to set at quiet the royal curiosity, but it appeared that everyone was giving a different opinion. One at length offered so ridiculous a solution that another of the members could not refrain from a loud laugh, when the king, turning to him, insisted that he should give his sentiments as well as the rest. This he did without hesitation, and told his majesty in plain terms that he denied the fact. On which the king, in high mirth, exclaimed, "Odds fish, brother, you are in the right." Okay. I don't know what odds fish. I don't know what that's supposed to mean. Odds fish, brother. Okay. Nevertheless, in this version, the problem is not entirely trivial one in fluid dynamics. Max Black has suggested, for comparison, the case of the weight of a cage with covered floor and sides and containing a bird in flight. However this may be, Charles' question, like, have you stopped beating your wife, carries with it a presumption which may prejudice an attempt to give a straightforward answer. A presumption is, oftentimes people will use this in a directly tricky way. They're like, answer the question, yes or no. Why can't you ask a yes or no question? This is happening right now where people are like, is Israel justified in defending itself? Be like, okay, that's like a milder version. You can see how that might work. You'd be like, well, if I say yes, you'd be like, okay, so then you can't have any objection to what's going on in Palestine. Like, well, no, because I wouldn't classify what's happening as self-defense, maybe. Yeah. So this is a way that certain kinds of bad journalists or bad actors can try to make it seem like they're getting dialectical assent, intersubjective assent to a premise, but they've really smuggled the premise into a question. I think it's pretty obvious how this one works. Hamblin objects because he's like, these aren't our arguments, right? He has this kind of, I think maybe slightly narrow view of argumentation, but this having been said, it remains to ask what relevance these examples have in a list of fallacies. A fallacy, we must repeat, is an invalid argument, and a man who asks a misleading question can hardly be said to have argued, validly or invalidly, for anything at all. What are his premises and what is his conclusion? I really disagree with him here. I think this is too narrow a version of argumentation, because Hamblin is remaining within the kind of philosophical tradition of an argument is an explicit premise, supported, premises that lead to a conclusion. But I think this fallacy actually makes it clear why we can't just have that view if we're trying to capture things that happen in real-world argumentation. Even in dialectical procedure, and the reason why this might have appeared in Aristotle, is even within this kind of formal argumentative procedure, question asking is part of the procedure of eliciting and clarifying the premises of the other person. So to say, oh, those aren't themselves arguments is kind of like weirdly narrow, I think, and undermines a little bit of the value of this point of view. But anyway, I do know what he means. Let's go to the next one. I'm going to need to get some water, though, now. Oh, it's almost 2 hours. Wow. And by water, I of course mean polar lime seltzer. Love a good seltzer. Okay. I don't want to kind of go on too long to make this video completely unwatchable. But so I'm going to skip a little bit of some of these sections where I think things are pretty self-evident. Let's go to ad hominem. This is maybe one of the most famous fallacies, one that people love to say the most is what's happening. Oh, that's an ad hominem. People have written whole books about this one fallacy. So let's see what he has to say. As we turn from Aristotle's list to later editions, our attention is claimed first by a group of alleged fallacies known as the argumentum ad hominem, the argumentum ad verecundiam, the argumentum ad misericordiam, and the argumenta ad ignorantiam, blah, 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 blah. He kind of goes on. All these ads, we feel like adding ad nauseam. But even this has been suggested before. Because he's like, ugh, I'm so tired of these lists of fallacies, right? Most of our books mention a few of them, though I do not know any of them that treats all. These Latin terms show how long these fallacies have long been recognized. A naive person might be surprised we still have them with us. Ha ha ha. These authors may be interested to know that the genre was invented by Locke. That guy, God. And that all but a few of the names are from the 19th and 20th centuries. Incidentally, as we shall see later, Locke does not clearly say that he regards them as fallacies. According to modern tradition, an argument ad hominem is committed when a case is argued not on its merits, but by analyzing, usually unfavorably, the motives or background of its supporters or opponents. I think that's a pretty good way of taking it. It's like, I'm not addressing the case. Again, it's like those arguments from relevance that we talked about before, and that he also mentioned these arguments as coming up in it, saying you're kind of ignoring the issue in a different way that maybe ignoratio elenchi ignores the issue. It ignores the issue entirely. It like goes to a different issue. So sometimes people will say today about whataboutism. I don't think that this is, I kind of agree with him that this is not a useful fallacy theory, isn't kind of really equipped, in my point of view, to deal with these questions of relevance. These questions of relevance are like deeply contextual, social, related to practices and contexts that fallacy theory I just don't think is strong enough to capture. Because fallacy theory really likes to look at terms, inferences. It has a similar kind of level or scope of focus as logic, and it's kind of microscopic. Relevance is scopic, but that's one of the questions. Is it macroscopic, microscopic? At what scope should we be talking here? What counts as being relevant or not? And this is very clear to those of people who have engaged in formal debates, not in the dialectical tradition, but in debate, where arguments about relevance always come up, or can always come up, and are not considered outside of the debate. They become part of the debate. What is relevant to the debate is part of the debate. So anyway, or one might, says Joseph, condemn Home Rule for Ireland on the grounds that Parnell was an adulterer. Okay, so Charles Parnell was a famous Irish advocate of Home Rule and leader of the Irish Republicans. I don't know if that was the formal name for them at the time. And being like, okay, well, Home Rule is bad because Parnell was an adulterer does clearly seem irrelevant to the case, because I think we would usually make the distinction between someone's representation of political views or political acts and their personhood and what they represent and maybe in their moral life. But it admittedly is often hard to maintain that distinction. There are certain, like if somebody is talking in a debate, the presidential debate, and they say, you're a liar and a scoundrel. It's like, well, maybe that is relevant to deciding whether you want to elect them, because maybe they're lying to us about their agenda. So again, that's kind of moral and legal considerations, like before, were kind of, are they really equivocations? Similar kind of issue here. When is ad hominem a fallacy, and when is it relevant? Is part of the argument itself. The main question, however, is not one of classification, but of whether our arguments ad hominem are genuinely fallacious. Several of our authors express doubts. Joseph says, a barrister who meets the testimony of a hostile witness by proving that the witness is a notorious thief, though he does less well than if he could disprove his evidence directly, may reasonably be considered to have shaken it, for a man's character bears on his credibility. Yeah, right. And sometimes we may be content to prove against those who attack us, not that our conduct is right, but that it accords with the principles which they profess or act upon. Being like, you're being a hypocrite, right? So that is an ad hominem argument almost always. Well, but maybe it's not irrelevant. Copy distinguishes two varieties of ad hominem argument, which he calls circumstantial and abusive. Circumstantial arguments are not always invalid, though it is not clear that when they are and why. Purely abusive arguments, on the other hand, are not arguments at all, though Copy does not say so. The further problem arises of distinguishing pure abuse from relevant circumstantial comment. Fernside and Holther, perhaps following Whately, contrast ad hominem with ad rem, which means to the point or relevantly. This contrast is sound enough in some contexts, but the latter is a legal term and has no historical connection with the former. Okay. So then we go through some of these other ones. Ad verecundiam. Verecundiam means shame or shyness or modesty, but an argument ad verecundiam is usually, not quite appropriately, regarded as an argument which rests on respect for authority. What Bentham calls the wisdom of our ancestors. Okay, I'm just going to ignore that part. Presumably, I can respect authorities without being ashamed, shy, or particularly modest. Copy says, advertising testimonials are frequent instances of this fallacy. We are urged to smoke this or that brand of cigarettes because a champion swimmer or midget auto racer affirms their superiority. There's just everyone's just taking so many strays here. There's so many kind of like racial epithets happening in these examples. I don't know why we need these things. I would say rather than ad verecundum, this is, I think, actually a pretty outdated one. I think we usually just say here appealed to authority, because when we even look at the Latin, appeal to shame or modesty is weird. It just doesn't accord with our sense. I would say it's an appeal to an authority is what we're really talking about here. Why is an appeal to shame is weird to me. The trouble with the quoted examples is that what corresponds with the first, X is an authority on the facts of type T. X had S, which is of type T, therefore S is true. The trouble with the quote example is that what corresponds with the first premise is false. At various historical periods, arguments from authority have been especially disliked, but this has been more because some particular authorities have been distrusted than because there's anything wrong with an argument proceeding from a premise which truly asserts expertise. Historically speaking, argument from authority has been mentioned in lists of valid argument forms as often as in lists of fallacies. And I think this is a very obvious thing, because when people are told in school, maybe you in your college classrooms are told to do research. What is invariably, what is the research that you're doing? You are looking up authorities on the matter which you're supposed to discuss, and you're supposed to cite them. This is an appeal to authority. It couldn't be more bold-faced and direct than that. You're saying, here's the authority. In fact, you have to say what the authority is. You have to cite it, or you're plagiarizing, all these kinds of things. So the question here would be, when is an appeal to authority fallacious and when is it not? We might say, forget about it. That's not the right way to deal with these questions. The question is whether the authority is good or not. Okay, that's one way to deal with it. Some authorities are actually not authorities, so we kind of want to investigate the evidence. But I think there also are times where someone could genuinely be an expert on something, or genuinely be recognized as an authority on something, and appealing to them in a certain context would be wrong. And that would, for me, be a more interesting analysis of this fallacy. Another way to think about it, and one thing I like to kind of bring up sometimes, is there are certain ways in which authority is socially distributed that affect our ability to make appeals to authority. So the example I like to use a lot is that expert witnesses in trials, you can bring in an expert witness, as happened in the first Rodney King trial, from the police. The police count as having expertise about police techniques. You cannot be an expert victim, which means that there's a kind of set up inequality in the kinds of argumentation that we have when we appeal to police as authorities on policing, because the victims can't have access to that in the same way. So these are interesting things to think about, but yeah, maybe fallacy theory doesn't kind of take us all the way there. Ad misericordiam, I already kind of talked about this one, about appeals to pity. Think of the children, that kind of thing, as when makes it us irrelevant to the case that we're talking about. Ad ignorantiam, the argumentum ad ignorantiam is illustrated by the argument that there must be ghosts because no one has ever been able to prove that there aren't, right? Evidence of absence is not absence, or absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, or the reverse of that. However, this mode of argument is not fallacious in the court of law because the guiding principle is that a person is presumed guilty until proven innocent. We have also guiding principles in our everyday affairs, but it must be a strange form of argument that is now valid, now invalid, according as presumptions change with context. I actually don't think that's strange at all, but this is because we come from different perspectives. Hamblin is coming from the perspective of the kind of logical philosophical tradition of argumentation. He's like, well, surely that can't be the case. And I'm like, no, that is actually the case. That is very pragmatically and obviously the case, that forms of argument change in their validity based on the context. I don't find any problem with that, but he does. Actually, belief in ghosts in the absence of evidence itself offends against a commonly revered philosophical principle, the Occamist. Entities are not to be multiplied unnecessarily. This is called Occam's razor. And perhaps that is what is really wrong with it. The argumentum ad ignorantium is nominally, in name only, an appeal to ignorance, but it is not quite clear from some of the examples given that it does not consist alternatively of a browbeating of ignorant people into accepting the views of the speaker. Baculum, populum, odium, etc. The other arguments odd are more rarely mentioned. I like ad baculum, though. This is so hopefully you'll talk about that one. Most of them are appeals to one or another specified emotion. Yeah, the argumentum ad populum is an appeal to popular favor, which, to preserve uniformity, must be purely emotional, though it is not clear from its name that it does consist of the purest valid reasoning, and only an anti-democrat could unhesitatingly assume the contrary. Right? So it's like saying that something is popular can't be like ruled out of argumentation. That seems sometimes relevant to arguments, or being like, people like this. Seems relevant to lots of political arguments. He's like, unless you hate democracy, then maybe then you think. The argumentum ad baculum is dignified with a paragraph by Copy. Baculum means stick, so this is an argument by threat. The preposition ad clearly means different things. We need not, however, pursue these argument forms further. Even Hamblin, the indefatigable Hamblin, is tired of this stuff. So, formally invalid syllogisms. The terms fallacy of illicit major, illicit minor, undistributed middle, four terms, are applied to arguments of traditional syllogistic form, which break one or another of the well-known set of rules. We shall describe these in more detail later. The fallacy of four terms, however, is worth special mention here because it illustrates a common confusion in modern accounts. An example of a syllogism which is claimed to commit this fallacy is all metals are elements. Brass is a metal, therefore brass is an element. Okay. Here, the premises have no link of connection and contain four different terms between them. Such mistakes are possible because of the ambiguity of language. If any term is used ambiguously, it is really two terms. Hence, the syllogism containing it has at least four terms, and it is not a true syllogism at all, though at first sight it might appear to be one. So let's go back to it. Say, all metals are elements. Okay, here it's an equivocation because metals in chemistry, we might say, to kind of specify it, are those elements. I mean, am I begging the question here? Are those elements that we call metals? So, but we also call other things metals that are not elemental, right? Brass is an alloy. So we call alloys metals. So this is an equivocation, right? So this is the idea that there's four terms here because these two uses of metal are different. That seems a lot like equivocation. Under this interpretation, the fallacy of four terms is a straightforward case of equivocation, but this is having things both ways. The middle term cannot be equivocal unless it is one term with two meanings. If there are really four terms, we have a formal fallacy independently of whether any term is equivocal. A implies B, C implies D, therefore A implies D. We'll be like, why? That's the real fallacy of four terms, is that you get presented two different premises, but there isn't any connection between them because they don't use the same terms. That's really what it is. Incidentally, there's nothing to prevent the other terms of a syllogism from being involved in the same kind of trouble. There's nothing to stop us from having a fallacy of five terms or six, blah, 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 blah. Fallacies of scientific method. Cohen and Nagel have invented special names for a number of fallacies under the heading abuses of scientific method. We read here about the fallacy of simplism or pseudo-simplicity and a fallacy of a number of particular fallacies, blah, blah, blah. We are told that hasty monism, the uncritical attempt to bring everything under one principle or category, is one of the most frequent perversions of scientific method. We also hear of the genetic fallacy, which is the fallacy of confusing temporal or historical origin with logical nature. There's no attempt at system or of completeness. The notion that the invalid induction is a species of fallacy is first explicit in the Port Royal logic. Finally, we reason sophistically, which is bad for these people, when we draw a general conclusion from an incomplete induction. When from the examination of many particular instances we conclude to a general statement, we have made an induction. After the waters of many seas have been found salty, and the waters of many rivers found fresh, we can conclude that the sea water is salty, but river water is fresh. It is enough to say here that imperfect inductions, that is, inductions based on examination of fewer than all instances, often lead us to error. I mean, this is actually, I think, an amazing example because, like, for them, the error here is that oceans are salty. And I'm like, that seems pretty well established. And maybe now, we have a little bit more access to water and testing. We can say, okay, we've advanced beyond this being an induction. We really have sampled enough that we can say that it might as well be a deductive inference at this point. But it shows you like a problem that some people have with induction, which is like if you literally don't sample every single instance, you can't know for sure. And it's like, well, yeah, but then we're not talking about sampling. We're not talking about that anymore. And there are clearly many, many things where we will just never have enough time to sample all of them. Like that would be, even as a standard for science, way too high. Science cannot operate with such a high standard. It has to use induction. The authors go on to give the example of the generalization: suction pumps can raise water to any height, and the at that time recent discovery that there is in fact a height limit of about 32 feet. We shall look later at the historical ancestry of this concept of fallacy. It has had few descendants, but there has been a thread of interest in it, and one of its main exponents is J.S. Mill. Of the modern books we have reviewed, only one, Salmon, has an explicit treatment of inductive shortcomings. Here we read, "Fallacy of insufficient statistics is the fallacy of making an inductive generalization before enough data have been accumulated to warrant the generalization. It might well be called the fallacy of jumping to a conclusion. We have met hasty generalization before under the heading of the secundum quid. Again, the fallacy of biased statistics consists of knowing an inductive generalization upon a sample, which is known to be unrepresentative one, or one which there is good reason to believe may be unrepresentative. A traditional example of this is from Francis Bacon, who gives a psychological explanation. The instance which is the root of all superstition, namely, that to the nature of the mind of all men, it is consonant for the affirmative, active, to affect more than the negative or privative." Okay, what is the affirmative active? I recognize a thing happening more often than I recognize a thing not happening. Well, that seems pretty obvious. Like, I don't experience things that don't happen. And so I don't count those as evidence in my experience. And so all of the instances of things not happening are kind of not accounted for. And so I overrepresent the positive data in my so-called sample set of experience, so that a few times hitting or presence countervails oft-times failing or absence, as was well answered by Diagoras to him that showed him in Neptune's temple the great number of pictures. Oh, this is my favorite example. Diagoras to show him in Neptune's temple the great number of pictures of which as had scaped shipwreck, and had paid their vows to Neptune, saying, "Advise now, you that think it folly to invocate Neptune in tempest." "Yea, but," saith Diagoras, "where are they painted that are drowned?" Okay. A very harrowing book by Primo Levi is called The Saved and the Drowned, which makes sort of an allusion to this. What's going on in this kind of early modern English text is a representation of this old anecdote. So Diagoras, who kind of denies the power of the gods, they bring him to Neptune's temple, and he sees all these little votive offerings for people that have been saved. And they're like, well, look, here's the evidence that Neptune's power works. And he's like, well, obviously there aren't representations of people who drown because they're dead. They don't come in and like take away one of the votive and be like, no, it didn't work in this case. So this is a kind of bias in the sampling. Joseph gives this an example of false cause. It will be seen that it is not very difficult to find a place in the traditional scheme for such examples, and this apparently tends to discourage go-it-alone originality of Salmon's variety. The difficulty that surrounds the definition of inductive fallacies in their own right is that of distinguishing at all precisely between good inductions and bad. Every philosophy students know what Hume made of this difficulty. What is most clearly wrong with the Port Royal account and its successors is that nothing definite is done to provide criteria. If an induction is based on fewer than all instances, it may lead us into error, but it may not. This leaves it open to everyone to adopt any inductive argument that happens to please him, and to censure as fallacious any he happens to dislike. To add to the public confusion, logicians are in the habit of presenting induction as an argument from particular to general in such a way as to guarantee that it commits the fallacy of the consequent. In one chapter of a textbook, we are shown schemata such as crow number 1 is black, crow number 2 is black, crow number n is black, therefore all crows are black, as examples of conditionally valid inductions, and in another we have given comparable arguments as unconditionally fallacious. We have already noticed the tendency to give as examples of the fallacy of the consequent instances of what might be construed as valid, or at least incipient inductions. So every crow that we see is black. Makes us think, okay, well, all crows are black. But what if we just haven't seen the crows that are white or purple or whatever? This is a problem for induction, for philosophers. Personally, I'm not so worried about this. I feel pretty confident going around being like, crows, as far as we know, are black. But I don't kind of want to say every time I say a sentence is as far as we know. I just make that a kind of background assumption about all of life. Like, as far as we know, this is what's working. And I'm not so hung up on that what I say may not be the absolute truth. To me, maybe part of this problem does come from an emotional place, where some people are very kind of... they really want their speech or their writing, their communication, to be able to be held up to the standard of absolute truth. And they get nervous if what they say might not meet that standard. And I think probably the more humble way of living is to realize, yeah, you probably not only will never meet that standard, but you won't really know if you miss it. And maybe that's not the right way to think about communication in general. But anyway, that takes us a little bit off the beaten path here. And then he goes into some miscellaneous fallacies. Which of these are any of these interesting to look at? Okay, this is, maybe we should just do it for the completeness' sake. That's a fallacy too. Miscellaneous. There's several varieties of fallacy or particular fallacies which have special names, but which are not really logical fallacies at all, but merely false beliefs. So if your premise is false, we don't usually think of that as a fallacy. We're just like, it's just wrong. The inference wasn't wrong, the premise was wrong, right? This is the sense in which the word fallacy is used in the title of Martin Gardner's book, Fads and Fallacies in the Name of Science, subtitled A Study in Human Gullibility, which examines for us every kind of scientific crankhood, from water divining to Scientology. I like that Scientology is well known here, but it still has a lowercase s. You know, they've earned themselves through all of their harassment an uppercase s now, I guess. In more philosophical context... Okay. Sorry for that disconnection again. I have no idea what's going on. I think it's because I updated OBS, which is the software I used, and sometimes when they have a new update, it's kind of like buggy for a while, which makes me not want to update it, but I do anyway. Terrible. Okay, anyway, sorry about that if that clipped out there for a second. So, okay, we're at the end here, basically. The pathetic fallacy. As I was saying, you might remember this from the Zhuangzi, the argument about the fish, the happiness of the fish between Zhuangzi and Huizi. How can you know the fish are happy if you're not a fish? And Huizi might kind of have accused Zhuangzi of making the pathetic fallacy. Most famous in modern times, perhaps, is G.E. Moore's naturalistic fallacy, which he describes as follows. It may be true that all things which are good are also something else, just as it is true that all things which are yellow produce a certain kind of vibration in the light. But far too many philosophers have thought that when they named those other properties, they were actually defining good, that these properties, in fact, were simply not other, but absolutely and entirely the same with goodness. This view I propose to call the naturalistic fallacy, which you could say, okay, this might seem familiar, but like that sounds like the fallacy of accident that we already talked about. Yeah, they all kind of overlap. Well, I don't know what to say. He is concerned with the identification of moral values with pleasure, usefulness, majority approval, greatest happiness of the greatest number, or any other quality which might conceivably be described independently of morality. In these cases, more things, we can still ask, is it pleasant? It is pleasant, but is it good? Illustrating that there is not an identity between the terms. Different classificatory systems for the logical fallacies lead to the invention of different classificatory terms. Mill, for example, though his account has little in it that is not covered in essence by what has already been said, has an original scheme of classification involving 5 broad categories. Fallacies a priori, which are false beliefs, prejudices, or superstitions, with which people approach a subject matter. A priori means before you've seen anything else, at the very beginning. Fallacies of observation, where the subject matter itself is falsified. Fallacies of generalization, including his treatment of faulty induction and false analogies. Fallacies of ratiocination, which are formal, fallacies of reasoning. And then 5 fallacies of confusion. Mill took his last title from Bentham, and it represents his ragbag category, including question begging, ambiguity, and ignoratio elenchi. We shall have occasion later look at some other attempts at reclassification, blah, 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 blah. But that's basically the end of the normal treatment. What's Hamblin's answer to this? You'd have to read the whole book to find it out. Hamblin is kind of on a project to try to rectify the treatment of fallacies and kind of make them better. I'm not so interested in that. I think there's something to be said for what he wants to do here, and I tried to assign chapter 7. I also tried to assign chapter 5 at one point, but there's just too much complicated stuff here with what he wants to do. But I would say if you want to kind of get into it, I would say look at these last few chapters where it becomes a little bit clearer what he wants to do differently. But this is from the 1970s, and it's probably not the cutting edge for that, but it is a pretty good treatment of the standard approach to fallacies. Why? I think because it's skeptical of the standard treatment of fallacies. And I think we should, if we're going to engage in fallacies, and the study of fallacies usually is supposed to make you kind of more skeptical of arguments. Well, we shouldn't forget that the fallacies themselves are arguments, that these are arguments that other people have put together for why certain forms of reasoning are bad, fallacious, suspicious, misleading, and that we shouldn't take them at their word. Who are these people? I mean, some of them are Aristotle, and I don't think we accept everything Aristotle says today, right? But anyway, that was a kind of long vision of what fallacies are, or what they might be, how we might wish to understand them. Another way you can kind of look into fallacies, if you got excited by this, is what I will do in class probably tomorrow. I'm just going to pull up the Wikipedia list of fallacies, and there's just like lists on the internet of like hundreds of these things. Are these valuable? Are these useful to kind of think with? What do you want to do with them once you know about these different fallacies? If you have an answer to any of these questions, please drop a comment below, and we can have a little conversation in the comments. And thanks for watching the video, and subscribe if you want to see more of this kind of content of people talking for a really long time about rhetoric, argumentation, stuff like that. That's what happens on this channel. Bye.